Welcome to How to Decorate from Ballard Designs, a weekly podcast all about the trials and triumphs of decorating and redecorating your home. I'm Caroline, I'm on the marketing team.
And I'm Taryn, and I'm a product designer.
I'm Liz, I head up the creative team.
We're your hosts. Join the expert team at Ballard Designs for tips, tricks, and tales from interior designers, stylists, and other talents in the design world.
Plus, we'll answer your decorating dilemmas at the end of each episode.
We love answering your questions, so don't forget to email us at podcast@ballarddesigns.net.
Now, on with the show. Our guest today is Santa Monica-based designer Christine Markatos-Lowe, a fine artist turned designer whose work has been recognized by Traditional Home Magazine, Luxe Magazine, House Beautiful, the Los Angeles Times, and more. In her work, Christine combines traditional and modern elements, as well as a vibrant mix of pattern and color to create timeless spaces for her clients. Today, we're going to talk about how color and spatial relationships can elevate your space. So, Christine, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
I loved getting to browse your portfolio and your website, and was really excited about the topic because, you know, you're a fine artist turned designer. You went to UPenn, you had an MFA in fine art, and I could really see that through the color palettes in your portfolio. And I imagine you have a lot to say on color and shapes just because of your fine art background. So I'm curious, maybe to start, you can kind of talk about your background in fine art and how that's impacted the way that you decorate, and particularly the way you use color in your decor.
Sure, of course. So I think that I would say, you know, my background in art really has informed the way I see things in the world more than anything. I studied undergrad, I have a studio art degree, and I was really involved in painting, color theory, printmaking, and sculpture. And I decided at the end of school that it was really sculpture that I thought I was, you know, the most interested in, and had applied and was accepted, and did an MFA program at Penn. And it was while I was at Penn that I really realized, and, you know, singularly focused in one type of art, that I missed those other elements. And I was trying to figure out what to do about that and just sort of my path. And interestingly enough, it was my sculpture professor there who said, "Oh, darling, maybe one day you'll just be a designer." Kind of put that idea in my head. I really didn't follow interior design. I came from, you know, my parents are sort of very intellectual about their approach to art. I was raised going, you know, I was raised outside New York City and went to museums, and we were, you know, very intensely educated in just the fine arts. And that was just something that had never entered into the language. And so he kind of planted that seed. And anyway, the long and the short of it is I moved back to New York, spent a couple months kind of doing a whole lot of nothing, trying to figure it out. And, you know, back in the day when there were job listings, they were listed in the paper. So there was a listing in the New York Times for basically an assistant position at an architecture firm. And I applied without having, you know, any real obvious skill set that was specific. And lo and behold, it was Peter Marino's office, and I was hired. And I was told in my interview, or my second interview when I was offered the position, that the reason I was hired was because Mr. Marino knew that I wouldn't have to be taught how to see, which I think is really an interesting 20 plus years later, a really interesting perspective on the artistic point of view, whether your medium is fine arts or you're in the decorative arts or whatever it might be. It's really about how you see spaces and how you see things. So that was a very long-winded answer to your question.
That was a great answer.
I think ultimately it's the background. It's like the support system to then what became a 12-year training that I went through, working for a couple of sort of well-known design firms and working my way up, you know, position-wise, and based on my skill set. As that increased and my understanding of design and the decorative arts increased, I kind of moved around. So I would say it's the cornerstone, though I don't think anyone, you know, it certainly wasn't a linear path. I'll put it that way.
So how do you think that your approach to color as an with an art background, I suppose, like sets your work apart from maybe other designers?
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately, my point of view is that color is emotional. And so living with color really, for me as a designer and what I'm bringing to our projects is really sort of the starting point with any project. We work with such a large range of color. We work with clients who like saturated color. We work with clients who want everything kind of what we call whisper colors, very, very soft palettes. Um, but ultimately, I think that's the starting point with every project is what is the feeling we are trying to evoke in the room, in the house, as the experience of living in the space. And from there, the story evolves using color.
One of the things that I really loved about your spaces is that, like, I was trying to analyze, I suppose, how you are using the color. And it seemed like there might be a blue, I'll give an example. There might be a blue room, but you've got warmer blues, you've got cooler blues, you've got some really dark, you've got some light. There's like this whole range. And I think often people kind of think of using color in terms of matching and like being consistent, when it seems like you're just
Right.
really kind of it's almost like you were painting with the color, but like there were gradations, I suppose. So I'm wondering if you could speak to that about using the like a fuller
Sure.
spectrum and why it works.
In studying color theory, there's this concept called the color wheel, which basically is a theory or an idea that colors can be organized based on their relationships to each other. And based on how you sort of use the color wheel and how the colors are juxtapositioned or placed next to each other, really allows you to kind of play with the concept of mixing colors. So, obviously you can start with a monochromatic palette, right? Which is the idea of you have a blue, you keep all the blues the same, and you sort of layer maybe with textures or pattern or different ways. That's very simple. You're kind of using one hue again being, where the color falls, right? Is it a primary color? Is it a secondary color? Is it a tertiary color? So you can start with a monochromatic palette, or you can do an analogous palette. So the idea of an analogous palette is that you have two or three colors that are next to each other in the color wheel, and you're sort of pulling from all of them. And if you contrast them with white, you create this really interesting balance. And I would say the majority of our projects are, it's not like I sit down and have this kind of conversation with the client, but just in working together, that tends to be where many people feel comfortable with the idea of mixing colors. You can also do something with much more contrast, and you would be getting into more of a complementary palette, red and green, blue and orange, but that's a much harder concept for people to adopt or understand. So typically we're working in more of an analogous palette.
I love the visual of the color wheel because I think we've probably all seen that at some point. And
Yeah,
it's such an easy map to follow.
it really is. And it feels like that's a lot to think about. But really, if you think about it, I mean, you can simply look in nature. There are so many examples in nature. For instance, this morning I was out in my garden and I was looking at my hydrangea, which, we're fortunate in California where our summer kind of lasts longer, but we are definitely entering into fall. And so I have these beautiful big blue blossoms still on the hydrangea, but they're all also turning different shades as they are losing their vibrancy. And so there's some purple and there's a little bit of red, and then you have the green of the leaves, which are also changing. And so it's really all out there for you to consider and see if you're looking.
And then can you speak a little bit to like varying values, like using some darker, using some lighter? What is it that's going to, I suppose, do for your room? Why would that help your overall space?
Well, it creates contrast and depth to your room. So similar, as you were saying before, that there's some sort of painterly aspects to looking at color. When you're doing design, you have areas where you might want to have a more saturated colors. So maybe you have a more saturated blue, but then you want to balance it with a dark piece of furniture in the background. And you might have a lamp that has some white and lighter colors on a painted dresser, and that pops your eye. The idea with the way we use color is we're always trying to, as we call it, move the color around the space. So whether that's going from room to room or even just within one room, it's not like this area is blue, that area is green. It's all kind of mixed and matched. Typically, when we're working on a house, we have a color from room to room that kind of carries the eye through. So if in your entry, we have some shades of green and maybe lavender, and then we move into the stair hall, there might still be a little lavender, but we might have shifted tones. This way, again, there's a continuity to how we're using color as you move through the space.
Now, what about, I know we've spoken to like true colors, and that's very obvious, but what about when to use, like a true white versus a creamier base?
So typically I make those decisions as the fabric palette has been confirmed. So again, if we're finding that a lot of the grounds, like if we're using a lot of patterns and a lot of the grounds are a much brighter white, one of my favorite go-to colors is OC17 from Benjamin Moore. It's called White Dove. It's a very pure white. It's a very pretty white. It looks great in New York. It looks great in Los Angeles. So it really works in a lot of different colors of light, which is so important when you are picking color. And if that feels too bright, then we might move into a softer tone, sometimes a more yellow white or sometimes a more taupey white, again, depending on, is the project contemporary? Is the project more traditional? What are the fabrics? What are the carpets? If there's a particular piece of art that we're working around, all of those things are factored into how we're making our choices.
And can you make white with this kind of off-white cream work? How do you make that live together well?
So I have a 1920s Spanish house. All the walls are plaster, and I probably have 4 different shades of white in moving through the house, depending on actually the natural light. Because some spaces, our stair hall has one window in it. It's much darker than my living room, which has French doors and like one of those huge traditional Spanish windows. So there's tons of light kind of pouring in. And I balance the whites. No one can tell. I'm not even sure at this point, but it was something that I did because I do like to feel consistency when I'm moving from room to room. And it was necessary to do so because of the natural light.
You basically use 4 different whites throughout your house, but because of the way each room's individual lighting is based on the natural light, they all look the same.
It does.
That is such a clever idea, and something that, well, probably is only something really a designer could do, but I suppose we could all sort of, a great takeaway would just be that like, a lot of people feel like, okay, well, I'm just going to paint this one color for consistency and like really, so they only have to pick one color, but it's going to look vastly different from room to room. So
I always suggest, even with our clients, when we're signing off on a paint schedule for the project and just the room selections, that they look at everything at night, because it really does impact how things look. There have been instances where we've had to make adjustments because things suddenly go very gray, particularly in California where we have so much natural light and it's so intense. Once you get into light where you're using incandescent bulbs or LED lights in the downlights, there's a shift in how that impacts the colors. It's good to make sure you're happy with the way everything looks, all the different situations that you're going to be living with it.
So say you are testing paint colors and you have a white that you like, or I suppose any color, a color that you like during the day. And then in the evening, maybe it feels too gray, like you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
Where do you go from there? Do you pick something warmer? Do you go lighter? Like, I guess, what is like the next color to try?
So I would increase saturation of the color, because saturation is talking about the vibrancy of the color. So if you have a blue that's very soft and when natural light reads gray, then you would want to maybe go a shade or two more saturated so there was more blue in it. to offset that grayness that you're seeing in the evening.
So, okay, sorry. Do you mean like saturated, like less muddy, or saturated like darker?
Saturated as in more intense.
Okay, got it.
So I guess darker would be correct.
Because I think that's something where it's easy to get hung up. Like you've tested your paint colors and maybe you know that you don't necessarily like it, but you don't know like how to fix it, I suppose, like how to get what you're trying to achieve.
I think it's always, ultimately, it's really about color saturation and increasing intensity and lessening intensity. I think that's a very easy consideration because on any paint deck, if you have a Benjamin Moore paint deck and you've picked whatever a particular color might be, they give you a range of lighter and darker within that particular color. And so you can look at your deck and say, well, I really loved this particular color during the day, but it's feeling a little washed out. So at night, maybe maybe we go one shade deeper and we look at that. And if that feels too intense during the day, the compromise might be to cut the color with white. And then you can go to your paint store and ask for samples. Can I cut it with 25% white, 50% white? We do that all the time. The other consideration really is in a particular room, how are you using that room? Like, is this a room you're really only in during the daytime versus a room that's really an evening kind of room? And you might make a concession. Well, I just love how this looks at night, so therefore I'm willing to live with it during the day, that kind of a thing. I'm also very picky, clearly. So I'm not sure I'm not sure that everybody suffers from the same need for it to be exactly perfect and balanced. But anyway.
Well, you know what? I think that as annoying as it can be to be agonizing over a paint color and to like go to the paint store a dozen times, it's far less annoying than living in a room that is the wrong color and
that you really dislike.
Because eventually you're going to want to paint it and you're going to have to do that process anyway. So you might as well just do it the first time.
Yeah, take your time, consider all the options, and with confidence, move forward. I mean, I think so many things are ultimately, if you allow them to be really instinctual, you'll have a reaction to something. Oh, I don't care for that. Or, oh, I'm thinking this. And then you kind of play with it. And we rarely go backwards. We make decisions, we move forward, and with confidence, we go into our installation. And I think that's obviously a learned skill, comes with experience and over time. But I think if you adopt that mindset, then you just realize you've just made a great choice and you're just going to move forward with it. And of course, you can always repaint.
Yeah. Okay, I have a theory about paint color swatches and I want to run it by you and see your thoughts on this. In my experience, which is admittedly not a ton, but I do love paint colors. I always find that if my paint swatch that I've put on the wall is a tiny bit too muddy and too dark for what I want the ultimate room to look like, that is the paint color I should pick. Because inevitably, once I paint all the four walls and it's lit and all the lighting is up, it for some reason reads lighter, more vibrant.
Yeah. Right.
You don't necessarily pick your favorite color is what you're saying.
Well, no, I pick my favorite of my swatches, but usually I'm looking at the sample and I'm like, this is like a hair too dark and maybe a hair too muddy for what I want. But so it's still my favorite. It's still like really close, but it still feels like, oh, it's just a little bit too dark. I'm always like a little worried that it's going to be too dark when I get it up. But once it is all painted, it's perfect.
So that's great. So that falls into what I just recommended, is that you just sort of make a decision and with confidence move forward, because there are so many factors going into it. For instance, like when you put up a sample of paint on the walls, it's not as if you're painting the entire room. And there are other colors, maybe the walls are white and you would like the room to be green. That white is impacting that color green that you're considering. So there's so many factors going into it. I think, I think it's sort of that your gut is that, oh, this feels good. Maybe it's not perfect, but it feels good. You move forward and then, you see.
There's just something about the color being on all four walls that I think makes it feel more vibrant,
Yeah, well, as I said, they're then balancing each other. They're not having some other color impacting how they read to each other, right?
Yeah.
And then there's the whole light as it moves through the room, which is also impacting color.
Mm-hmm.
Do you find yourself tending to use certain colors based on the direction like rooms face at all? Like north rooms?
I really don't. It's kind of about the start of a project comes from a couple different points of view. One is if the client has an art collection that we are working with and how they want that art to read. So that is a different perspective than when we're using really the textiles and the wallpapers and all of the materials to kind of create the art. And then the art comes secondarily into the project. So really based on that is kind of how we get started. If it's not an art collection that we're working with, then what we start to do is we pull different papers or fabrics that we think might be of interest to the client. And sometimes they're like, oh, I love everything here. And sometimes I might just love one thing. And if they can tell us what it is about that one thing that we love, it's really like a starting point for the project. So it's a very, the process is very collaborative with our clients. And I find it's most fun when they're really excited about, whether it's one particular thing or lots of different ideas that we bring to the table. And from there, we really set the colors of the space. So lighting, of course, natural light has something to do with what we're looking at. And we might, shift things based on the natural light, but it's really more of an emotional reaction to the colors that we're presenting.
A minute ago, you mentioned like using color sort of to embody emotions, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
And or like it's like an emotional tool to sort
Yes.
of create that feeling in the space. And I'm curious if there are certain colors or combinations, or I guess like strategies around using color that you associate with different emotions. And maybe like you could give us some examples of how you took a color and used it to convey this feeling that you're trying to capture.
Well, as an example, we almost always use very soft colors in bedrooms. Most people want their bedroom to feel inviting, encompassing, a place where they can go and relax and rest. And typically that translates in a very soft palette. So that might be using blues, that might be using lavenders. We use all shades of green. I think green really is a color that's like a neutral because you have the green of the exterior, right, as kind of your background color. And so bringing green into the interior is very soft and soothing. I've had maybe one or two occasions where a client has asked for their bedroom to be really bright and poppy, which is very interesting to me because that, to me, it seems like that would be different than you might want to feel. But she felt that it was really important to, one in particular felt that it was really important to wake up in the morning and feel a vibrancy. And she loved that idea. And so we went with a very bright hue of greens and aquas and celadon colors to create that for her.
I think you mentioned sort of in the beginning in your introduction, working with Peter Marino, which we just had another guest who worked with Peter Marino, literally, I think our last interview, which is so funny.
That is funny.
Anyway, but I was curious, sort of transitioning from color about how, I guess, like working with an architecture firm, I guess, sort of informed your use of space, layouts or the way things relate to each other in terms of the space itself.
So working at Peter Marino's office was the most eye-opening, incredible experience. I mean, I could not have asked for a better starting education. So certainly architecture played into it, though the way that office was set up, interiors and architecture were very separate departments. So by the time we had the architectural drawings, everything was kind of organized and set. And then, we were working on a different phase of the project. So that certainly informed me. I think more, though, what I was informed with from working there and seeing projects, because I was very junior when I was there, was seeing how the spaces were organized from a three-dimensional perspective. So yes, certainly furniture plans, and then going and, seeing the furniture plans in the office, and then getting to go to the site of the project and during installations and seeing them actually in space was, incredible for me and very informative. Um, but I think more than anything, it was the use of his three-dimensional perception in the space and the sculpturalness of all of his spaces, which are supported by the incredible architecture that office does, the materials that are used in the architecture, which are also, always of impeccable quality. I think that was the most informative part of having worked in an architect's office. After that position, I did not work in an office that had an architectural department. As I continued on in my career, we obviously were working with outside architects, which was also a very interesting experience to sort of see how to then take someone else's designs, and as the collaboration of the project was moving forward, how the two parties, who was kind of the starting point in the parties. That was another experience that I had that was different, and it's very interesting. Depending on the design firm I was working with, sometimes the architect was really leading the story, and other times the designer was really leading the story. And I found over time that was typically dependent on the relationship of the client.
But that must vary just so much by project, right?
It really does. If the designer has been working with the client long term and brings in an architect, often the client is still looking to the designer, for all of the input. And the designer also has the knowledge of how the client likes to live. And that also works in reverse, where the architect has really been working with the client, or the project was started with the architect, and then the design team comes in when the drawings are further along. And it's a push-pull. And in the best way. I think the best projects are when each of the teams is very collaborative.
Do you find that the architecture firms are asking, like, where's the overlap of kind of what you're figuring out about the client? Like the overlap of how you live, what you love, what you gravitate towards I was just wondering how much of that, I mean, obviously the direction can go different ways based on how you approach it versus an architect, of course, I would imagine. But I was just wondering what the overlap on actual getting from clients, like information is.
Well, I think to some degree, it depends on whether it's a ground up build versus a renovation, right? So a ground up build obviously has the architect involved significantly in advance of needing a design team in terms of siting the house and the development of the house based on, sort of scope and room size and all the things that are on the client's list of wants. And then typically once that has been established, the designer might take a look at it and offer suggestions. Oh, well, in this particular room, we really would love to have seating where it allows for a view of a television as well as looking out at the view, so to speak. And that might change a little bit or need the architecture to be tweaked a little bit based on sort of entrances or other details that might have been more specific to what the architect was seeing, but might not work necessarily as well with the actual living and use of the space. So that's really where I would say that the collaboration happens, the push-pull. And sometimes, the client might say, no, this is really important. I really want this symmetry, and we're going to keep that, and we'll just work around the other. And other times they might say, no, it's more important that when I'm sitting here, I have the view of, out. I have this one particular view, and I can also see the television. So it just depends on preferences. And the best is when you can come up with a solution that everybody's happy with.
Okay, wait, sorry. I just had some more questions about color, so I want to jump back a little bit. I was just kind of thinking back to the color palette conversation, and you spoke to like often using more like analogous color palettes where you're sort of using like colors that are next to each other on the color wheel. And often that's sort of determined by your conversations with the client, what they're comfortable with and where they're interested in going. But I'm curious, like once you've kind of zeroed in on maybe like a color or a shade, how then are you sort of like building out the palette
Mhm.
to include more colors, and like maybe you could walk us through sort of like your thought process. Like, here's what I'm starting with. I'm going to use this because it does XYZ, and then I'll add this for over here. Like, I guess, what does that internal monologue sound like?
Sure. So I think what happens is once we've had the conversation of what they like, and sometimes it's even just really they've pulled a couple of pictures, whether it's from Instagram or Pinterest. Oh, I love this room. Why do you love that room? Well, I think that the palette of this room is so beautiful. Like, okay, great. Now we get that. And then what we do is we go out and we shop. So we might shop rugs, we might shop fabrics, we might shop wallpapers, something that's kind of pulling those things together. And I often find, whether it's a wall covering or a fabric, that has combinations of different colors that might be mostly in that kind of analogous palette, but then might have an accent of, if we're looking at sort of blues and greens, that it has an accent of yellow in it or has an accent of pink in it, something else. And so from there, it's like, wow, well, if we use this on the curtains, suddenly we have a whole lot of these different colors in the room. And therefore, we can have, a pink chair over here, and we can have the, a green and blue stripe, and we can mix all these things, and it all starts to kind of make sense. So that is a way for people who are wanting to do this on their own to think about it, is if you find something that suddenly serves as your inspiration for your room and you use it with a big bold stroke, you will find that it's very easy to mix in these different colors that you might not have considered doing before.
That makes sense. Having that anchor piece. And do you feel like the
Yeah.
anchor piece does need to be a bold stroke, or can it be a pillow?
It could be a pillow. It could be a lamp. It could be something that I have one client. This is so funny. I have one client who her wedding china is this amazing Royal Copenhagen pattern that I don't unfortunately know the name of, but it was its colors of kind of steel blue and peach and gold and a little bit of pink and cream. And when we started her project, this is an apartment in New York, she said, I want this palette throughout my house. And that was how we started.
Wow.
So,
Is
yeah.
that unusual for a client to have such like a, I suppose, like strong concept for the whole thing? I mean, what a great
Yeah, it was
place for
really
you.
fun.
Yeah.
It was I don't think at the time that it was a palette I had really put together before. So it was so gorgeous. I mean, the china is so gorgeous. So it was like, why wouldn't we use that?
Mm-hmm.
This is great. And so then we just went out and shopped it and kind of got started on it, and it all evolved. I find that generally speaking, my clients have a point of view. And it might be, I love aqua and blue. And it might be, as detailed as I have this amazing antique textile and I just love it and I want to use it. And let's start there. So it just runs the gamut. It's been pretty rare that I have someone who I've worked with who says, I have no idea.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So, okay, in the example of the client with the dinnerware,
Yeah.
like, okay, so you mentioned there were like shades of blue, there was pink. Like, how does that turn into a whole house palette? Like, are you using every color in every room? Are you using like one color primarily per room with like accents of another? Like, how does it kind of look and like be feathered out into the different spaces?
Yeah. So her living room has a really beautiful herringbone wall covering that has a tiny shimmer of like pearl in it. So it's basically pearl and cream. So it's very subtle. And then we did very simple creamy sheer curtains that have a little silver thread that runs through them. And the upholstery fabrics were shades of kind of peach and salmon and accented with the pearl and the silver and a little bit of gold tones. So it's very light and shimmery. It's kind of like the inside of a shell. And it's a very bright room. It's very pretty. And then from there, when we moved into the den, she wanted something a little deeper because that was going to be a room that they mostly use at night. So we pulled a little deeper blue shade from the china, and we did this amazing harlequin wall covering, which are enormous white and blue blooms, and used a really fun blue stripe on her sectional, which is shades of, like, I think the stripe repeats with 5 or 7 different shades of blue. And we did a very simple rug, and we added in a few accents of kind of the peachy tone, but the peachy tone went slightly browner in there. And then as you move into the hallway and her kitchen, it was again kind of the taupey, silvery, gray, creamy tones. So it would feel very neutral in there. And then when you move back into her bedroom, it was she wanted a really dark bedroom. So we went with a very dark blue grass cloth and accented it with some brighter tones of the peach. And we added in some different purpley toned accents. It is very cool, and it's very dark, which she loves. And so we go from, in the space, and then there's her daughter's bedroom and a guest room, which had a little bit more of, I would say, input from the people who use it. But you go from a really light, ethereal feeling as you move through the space to the back of the primary bedroom, which is, darker, kind of in the back of the building. And it becomes this very sort of nesting cocoon.
That is thank you for talking that out, because I feel like that was so helpful. Like, because basically what you're doing is you're pulling from the color that corresponds to the feeling, like you're cherry picking from the overall palette, the colors that work for the feeling you're creating in the room. And that makes so much sense. It's so logical, but I probably would have never been able to articulate it or come up with that sort of, strategy. I love that. That's so smart.
Thank you. Thank you.
It was described so beautifully too. All the words you said. The pearlescent wallpaper.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you. Well, it's fun because I was visualizing it as I was talking about it. So again, having that kind of emotional experience evoking how you feel when you're in the different spaces.
Are there any palettes right now in general, because we're all talking about color today, that you have been recently just really excited about?
Well, we finished a project 6 months ago, maybe 9 months ago now, here in Santa Monica, and a really fun client whose bedroom I described, very vibrant. The entire house is very vibrant. Quite fun to do for her because I feel like she pushed me into having vibrancy in every room. And the house runs from fuchsia to, sort of this incredible cornflower blue, brighter blues in her family room upstairs, this really vibrant green bedroom. And we offset everything by using different wall coverings that were much softer than the fabric choices, which were so vibrant, and a lot of sheer curtains to let the light really come in. And it was so successful, and it was so much fun to get pushed because it required a client who really believed and knew what she liked. And as soon as she would see things, she's like, oh, that's so great. Oh, there was nothing that was too bright that we could show her. And so it was really fun to work with somebody where we weren't, pushing them to do more or saying, oh, you should really consider this. She just was like, yes, let's do it. Let's do it. I think it's going to work. And ultimately she was very happy. So yeah, that was fun.
I love that. I love hearing just, how to not make color so kitschy. I think there's a lot of fear in that, right? And so
absolutely.
Thinking about what you said, just if you have some fabrics you love that are bold, just taking the step back on the walls, right? Like making it so that the fabric sings, your walls step back, but coordinate and make it all tell the same story. That's a great,
exactly.
Yeah. Because my biggest fear is picking a color that is bold and impactful to me. And then once you get it, like, again, fully saturating a room, you're like, and this feels childish. Like what did I do wrong?
Right. Well, I think the truth is decorating is expensive. And so I think because of that, everybody becomes cautious because it's a financial commitment to, have that fuchsia sofa or whatever it is, the choice that you're making. And so I think because of that, the general tendency is to play it safe because you had a gray sofa before and you liked it just fine. And so if you pick another new fabric that's gray, you're going to like it as opposed to that, aqua stripe. Oh my gosh, am I going to hate this in a year? Am I going to hate it the minute it's done? Who knows? So I think that does hold people back. But I really do believe if you find something that really has inspired you and you love that palette, you're just playing off of that to create a bigger moment of the same thing. And likely you will love it. And there might be something that you decide, oh gosh, I have too much of that one particular element in that color. And maybe you might shift that. But I think generally speaking, you'll be happy with the results.
All right. Well, Christine, thank you so much for joining us. Can you tell everyone where they can find you and follow you?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this. Marketosdesign.com. And our Instagram is Christine Markatos Design. I look forward to seeing everyone there.
Yes. And I just have to say, everybody needs to go check out your website because I loved getting to go through your portfolio. So pretty.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
Your Instagram is very inspirational as well. So it's a great follow.
Thank you. Thank you, ladies. Appreciate that.
And that's our show. You can find all of the show notes on our blog, howtodecorate.com/podcast.
To send in a decorating dilemma, email your questions to podcast@ballarddesigns.net so we can help you with your space.
And of course, be sure to follow us on social media at Ballard Designs.
Don't forget to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. And please leave us a review. We'd love to hear your feedback.
Until next time, happy
Happy
decorating.